everyone, and welcome to APS Webinars. The title of today's webinar is Careers in Physics Workshop, Putting Your Science to Work. I'm Crystal Bailey, and I'll be your host for today's broadcast. Thank you all very much for joining us. APS Webinars are brought to you as a service of the American Physical Society, connecting you with the expertise of individuals who can offer insight into physics careers, educational programs, and professional development for students, working physicists, and educators. Today's presentation features Peter Fiske, who will give you loads of great tips and strategies for connecting with success in your physics career. If you have questions during the presentation, you can enter them through the questions panel located on the right side of your screen. We will pause at a few points during the broadcast to answer questions that have come in, and we will have plenty of time at the end for an open Q&A. We will do our best to cover all the questions you submit, but apologize if we're not able to get to everything. We also will take a moment towards the end of the presentation to give you an opportunity to give us valuable feedback on the presentation. I will paste a link in the questions box that will take you to a quick survey. If you could take a moment to fill that out, we would be very, very grateful. Also, a link to the recording of today's presentation will be emailed to you after today's event and will be made available online. You can expect to see that follow-up email within about 48 hours of this broadcast. Okay, so with that housekeeping out of the way, let's get started. Peter Fiske is Executive Director for the National Alliance for Water Innovation, a coalition between labs, universities, and U.S. water companies committed to developing game-changing technologies to enable distributed desalination and water reuse. He is also a seasoned executive with more than 2 decades of experience leading technology organizations and initiatives that have touched on optics and semiconductor manufacturing, biomimicry-inspired, high-efficiency fluid mixing and process control technology, and has served as a board member or advisor to a number of technology startups. Peter is also a nationally recognized author and lecturer, teaching innovation, entrepreneurship, and personal career strategy to scientists and engineers in industry and research. He is a regular contributor to Nature and a past columnist for Science. His articles have also appeared in The New Scientist. Peter is also the author of Put Your Science to Work, the most widely read career strategy guide for early career scientists and engineers. He is a frequent keynote speaker and lecturer at leading research universities and has given his acclaimed 2-hour workshop to over 25,000 scientists and engineers in the US, Europe, and the Middle East. Okay, Peter, with that, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Crystal, and welcome everybody to this latest version of Put Your Science to Work. Now, as you all know, I regret that we are not here in the same room and the Denver spring meeting of the American Physical Society. But as you know, prudent judgment dictated that we should do this remotely. So I'm happy to be with you here remotely and give you a little sense for how we're going to do this today. I have the workshop material, and we're going to run for about 80 minutes. Then we will have a short break. During that break, we will discuss some questions that you have. And then after that break, we will run for another 60 minutes. And then that'll be the end of my prepared remarks. And we will have a long Q&A at that point. And that Q&A can involve any questions that you have about what we discussed today, or potentially other questions that you have, maybe even specific questions. Because what I have found is that many of you have very similar situations. And so even though you may feel like your situation is unusual or unique, there's often other people who would benefit from hearing what you have to say. So I'm very happy that we could do this here. And I would also note, as Crystal and I were talking before we turned on the webinar, that of course this is a carbon-free workshop. So we haven't had to burn a lot of hydrocarbons to travel. So maybe that's a little silver lining around the dark cloud. As Crystal said, I'm a practicing scientist at Lawrence Livermore Lab now, and I'll tell you a little bit about my past, but I'm the author of Put Your Science to Work, which was a career guide that I wrote almost 20 years ago. And I've also been writing in Nature under a series of columns for the last 5 years. And in it, I have been sharing with mostly early career scientists, but frankly, people at any stage in their scientific career, some of the practical advice I have accumulated over the years in researching my book and journey in my own professional career. And let me tell you a little bit about that. Because, I know that it's easy for everybody to think that, scientific career or career in physics should be a very linear process. And, it started out that way for me. I got my PhD in geochemistry and material science from Stanford University, and then went dutifully off to Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, where I was a postdoc for 3 years. But all along, I was having concerns about whether I was in the right place. And so in 1996 and 1997, I took a sharp left turn and did a policy fellowship in Washington, D.C., thinking that that would be the perfect place for me for the rest of my life. Well, very quickly into my policy year, I realized that maybe that wasn't the right choice. And so I switched. I went back to Lawrence Livermore Lab. I was a scientist for another 4 years. And then I realized that there was a larger opportunity for me outside of the scientific world. And so I left to get an MBA and start my first company. This was a company called Pax Water Technologies. I'm sorry, it was Wrapped Industries. So I co-founded Wrapped Industries from 2001 to 2008. And then in 2008, I moved to Pax Water Technologies, and actually have still involved in Pax Water Technologies. But 3 years ago, left a full-time position there, and I'm now director of a research institute on water treatment at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. So, it was a pretty circuitous path for me. And in fact, many times careers have a very circuitous path. And so one of the first lessons I want to leave you with is that there's no such thing as a linear career in science or any other career. And sometimes we need to open our minds to the possibility that something unusual might actually hold a tremendous amount of potential for us. Years ago, I saw this image on the cover of a book. I was actually in my 4th year in graduate school. And in my mind, it precisely encapsulated everything that I was feeling about my life in graduate school at that point. Because up until that point, I had been an undergraduate and a graduate student. I had a very clear idea that I wanted to go on to a career in science. And you all know what the normal career path is for an academic scientist. It's undergraduate degree, graduate school, postdoc, assistant professor, tenured professor, retirement, and then off you go. And, this idea that I was in this wonderful academic bubble was very comforting. And there's the sun, there was my advisor, the sun in my Keplerian universe. And all the rules were very clear in that academic world. But in my 4th year in grad school, I began to worry that there were aspects of the quote unquote academic career that really weren't a very good fit for me. And so I began to explore. And that early part of exploration, frankly, was very unsettling because I was poking my head out from under this familiar environment that I knew, this academic research world. And I was gazing out into this totally unfamiliar world of business and policy and all these things. And frankly, it was very frightening. It was frightening. And so I have found over the years, whether or not you desire to stay in academic research and physics for the entire career, or whether you're already decided to do something different, it doesn't matter. But I find that the process of exploring these other potential career paths is very empowering for you as a physicist. It's empowering for you, and if you go on to train other students, it is empowering for you to be able to give them some practical advice about all the pathways that might be available to them. And so that's one reason why I emphasize that this is what we're going to talk about today in this workshop is not about abandoning science. This is not about an either or. As you can see in my own career, I've had a somewhat, circuitous career, but it's been enormously satisfying, intellectually incredibly exciting, and I have used my scientific background every step of the way. And so this is one thing. Careers don't come in one mold, even though when you spend a lot of time in academia, you might think that they do. But there's another reason why I'm really here, and that is, as I said to you, my career path has really been very unusual so far, but it's been very stimulating and enormously enjoyable. And as we do in science, I've accumulated an amount of advice and practical strategy. And as we do in science, we share our results with our community. And so I am here today to share with you some of this practical advice I've received over the years. I will also tell you that I have some degree of concern that even young scientists and engineers don't get very good career development advice. Even with new programs such as those put on by the American Physical Society, most of your time is spent in an academic department, usually a physics department, usually with physicists as professors, who themselves don't have a lot of perspective about what else is out there. And that this advice for what you could do with your career is of greatest value now, while you're relatively early in your career. This is the time where this advice really matters to you. And I will finally admit that I guess I have a little bit of a PhD chauvinism. I genuinely believe that PhDs have the potential to change the world. Not even PhDs. I know that some of you are masters and some of you are undergraduates, but science-trained people have the ability and opportunity to change the world. And in fact, we've been doing it for hundreds and hundreds of years. And yet, I recognize that at certain points in your career, you come up against these very uncertain moments on transition points, and you can feel like your options might be very limited. So what we have today is a combination of some practical career advice, some good strategies that you can employ, and frankly, a little bit of a pep talk, because frankly, I was in your shoes many years ago as well. One of the most important things that I contended with was really thinking about why I chose a pathway in science. I know that you've been doing it for years, as I was, but I really didn't think about what had led me onto the career path that I was on by the time I was in graduate school. For me, I grew up in a scientific environment, in a scientific family, and I loved exploration, and the natural world fascinated me. This is me and my sister out playing in the dirt as we did every summer, because my father was a scientist. He was a geologist and had a marvelous career traveling around beautiful parts of the world, and it just seemed like a fun career and an exciting challenge. I also admit that I was a Trekkie. I loved the original Star Trek. I watched every episode over and over again, and I found that the adventures that this group of explorers had was really exciting, and it seemed very meaningful to me. And in particular, I really liked Captain Kirk. And in fact, I wanted to have an impact on the world and also be recognized for having an impact in the world. And so with all those experiences as a kid, that was what ended up driving me towards science. And this is why this is the first question I start with for these workshops. Why did you become a physicist? What was it about your background, your upbringing, your parents maybe, or maybe it was some random experience, some random encounter you had with somebody that sparked an interest that led you to where you are today? The specifics of your story are not, better or worse, but I find that the story of how you came into science to be very helpful because it tells you a little bit about what fundamentally drives you forward in life. And while you have been training in physics, in fact, you may actually also be prepared to do a wider range of things than just physics. And your origin myth, this idea of where you come from, can be an important part of giving you clues as to what that is. Also, I will say that why you became a physicist is a great story to be able to share to people, for example, when you're in a job interview. Because what you do for a career is honestly a very personal thing. It's, of course, influenced by your parents and your family. It's influenced by your upbringing. It's influenced by your personality and temperament. And of course, it's influenced by random encounters and chance opportunities. You happen to meet a person at a given moment in your life where you happen to see something that really excites you, and that is how your pathway is set. So I recommend that being familiar with your own story is the first step into charting your career. Now, one thing I like to emphasize is that academia and the world that you're in presently has been changing a lot, And it didn't used to be so different. It used to be in the old world that academia and the outside world were very similar. You'd go to school for a set of skills. And you'd go get a job after you get those skills. And you look for a job with job security, because you'd find a single employer who would, provide an opportunity for you to be employed for your entire career. And you'd look for a job with a good salary, because salaries were how people were rewarded. And you'd look for a company that was big, that had big assets and big infrastructure, because big companies were safe. Nothing bad could happen to big companies. Big companies would stay around forever. In this old model, seniority was what mattered most. It was almost always the oldest guy, and almost always a guy running an office. Guilds were everywhere, that is to say, organizations and loose affiliations of skilled people. Risk aversion was the smart thing. Keep your head down, do your job, you'll get a steady promotion. And passivity was the safe bet. Don't make waves, don't do things different, follow the rules, and you'll get ahead. Today's environment is very, very different. In the outside world, lifelong learning is a critical aspect to career development. For every job you take, it's not just what you earn, but what you learn in the job that matters. Today, risk-taking is actually good. The ability to take calculated but important risks is one of the key elements to advancing in a career. And today, especially for technical people, stock options, not salaries, are the largest fraction of compensation for people, in particular in smaller tech companies. Intellectual property, IP, is typically the biggest asset on most companies' balance sheets. Now, a balance sheet is a list of financial information that you see from most companies, and they list assets and liabilities and shareholder equity. Under the assets column, intellectual property today is usually the largest single value that's in any company's portfolio. And intellectual property is the stuff that you make for a living. Today, experience is what matters most. Independence, that is to say, consultants are everywhere. Risk management is the smart thing, and entrepreneurialism is the safe bet. Well, look at the contrast. Look at how much has changed in the world of work from the old style to today's environment. Now, the reason I bring this up is that, frankly, there are a lot of elements of academia that tend to reinforce this old kind of mindset. I mean, it's in many ways, academia is a very exciting place. It's where the frontier of knowledge is being created. But at the same time, in many practical ways, academia is very conservative. It has a very hierarchical structure. It has lots of traditions that are hard to change. You know, where else do you run around every spring in a black robe and a funny hat muttering Latin? That's in academia. And so in some respects, one of the things I find when I meet early career physicists who are embarking on a career outside of academia, a lot of times they encounter some of this cultural clash between what they thought would be valuable and what they thought would be important inside the academy is now very different outside the academy. And so this is one of the things that I hope that we can train our next generation of physicists to be prepared for better. Now, the need for PhDs to think broadly about themselves is not a new issue. This has been a perennial subject of discussion amongst policymakers in Washington, D.C. for a long time. Here is one quote: "Young people themselves don't realize how valuable they are with a PhD. It means an ability to think deeply, solve problems, analyze data, criticize and be criticized. PhD-trained graduates often don't realize the breadth of what they're capable of doing." Now, this quote was by this man, Dr. Neil Lane, who happened to be the director of the National Science Foundation, and he wrote this in 1994, almost 25 years ago. Crazy. So we've been talking about the issue of PhDs and the breadth or narrowness of the PhD degree for a long time. And frankly, in my career so far, I have not seen the PhD change that much. What I have seen is that your generation, this younger generation of emerging PhDs, are asking a lot more questions about what are the pathways available to me with a physics degree and who can I talk to? And those are very good questions to ask. Because when I asked those questions, back when I was getting my PhD, I ended up discovering something very important. PhDs possess many of the traits and skills that are of the highest value in the real world. Not just quote unquote transferable skills, but highly, highly marketable skills. And I didn't realize that at the time. Now, this guy helped me a lot. Al Levin was a graduate career counselor at Stanford when I was a graduate student back in 1992. Al himself was getting his PhD in the School of Education, and he was a counselor in the Career Planning and Placement Center. Now, I was in my 4th year, and I think you can begin to tell my 4th year was a little bit of a rocky time for me. The research was going okay. I wasn't necessarily close to finishing. I'd been there a long time, and I really was uncertain. I also found that there were a lot of things about the academic life and my advisor's life that I didn't really like. So in sort of a moment of panic, I made an appointment and went over to the Career Planning and Placement Center and had an appointment with Al Levin. Now, we had a great conversation because Al had been out for a number of years, but he'd come back to get his PhD. And he had remarked that a number of PhDs reach this crisis in their 4th year, where they really begin to question the path that they're on and wonder about, where they should maybe be going instead. And so he left me after that first session with a really great practical exercise. He said, Peter, I want you to go back to your office and I want you to write down a list of the transferable skills you think you've learned in graduate school. Not the specific stuff related to your PhD thesis or your research, but the broader things that you think are valuable. And so I went back to my office and I sat down. I pulled out a sheet of paper and I started to write. And I said, well, grad school gave me the ability to function in a wide variety of environments and roles. I was a synthetic chemist. I was a computer programmer. I was at times I was a Xerox copy repairman. I had to do a whole bunch of different roles as a graduate student, and I had very little instruction. I had to learn a lot on my own. Teaching skills. The ability to conceptualize and explain concepts, advanced and complex subjects to people who don't understand them was a very valuable thing I learned in graduate school. Counseling and interviewing skills, public speaking experience. A lot of people don't appreciate the amount of experience that you get during graduate school in presenting information to other people. Supporting a position or viewpoint with argumentation and logic. That is what we do in our career. Conceiving and designing complex studies. And I kept writing and writing and writing and writing and writing. And after about 2 hours, I had come up with this list. And I looked back on the list, I was like, dang, that seems pretty good. I was beginning to feel a little bit better about myself. And so the next week I took this list back to Al and he said, did you appreciate that a science degree teaches you these things? And I had to admit, we don't know, not really. We talk about science, we talk about physics, we talk about our experiments and our publications, and we talk about that as if that is the most important thing. And we don't talk about these broader transferable skills. And he said, well, these skills, these transferable skills, are the most valuable thing you've learned in grad school. These are the things that are going to make the rest of your career. And it wasn't just the transferable skills he was talking about. Al also said that there are personal qualities that many physics-trained people have in abundance that are also sometimes undervalued. I mean, intelligence. Let's just be honest here. You wouldn't be part of this whole community, you wouldn't be on this webinar today if you weren't already pretty darn smart, okay? Physics is a very demanding field. It's a very demanding subject of curriculum. You all have done extremely well with extremely challenging material. You are smart. And one of the funny ironies is that you've been hanging around smart people for so long that you have forgotten that you're smart. You've been hanging out with all these other nerds, and you don't realize that you're a rare bunch. A lot of the rest of the planet do not have the same intellectual capacity that you have. And so with this personal list that Al and I wrote together and the transferable skills list that I wrote myself, I began to be curious about where a technically trained individual like myself could potentially find value and valuable opportunity. And that began a journey I took at the end of my graduate school in which I interviewed hundreds of employers in all sorts of industries. I went around and met PhDs who had quote unquote left science and gone to a wide variety of different environments. And I found that employers in all fields are looking for people with these traits and personal qualities. These are the highlights of successful people in the outside world, not just in the academic world. Now, along the way, the other thing I did was I began to do a series of surveys, written surveys, and I typically would seek out people who've gotten their PhD in the physical sciences and who were now doing something totally different. People in government, in business, in law, in the arts. And I asked them a whole bunch of questions, but one of the questions I asked everybody was this: of the many skills you developed while in grad school, which skills are the ones that are most valuable to you now? And over the years, I've gotten lots of great feedback on this question. One person wrote, finding one's own path and taking initiative with little assistance. Yep, that is grad school. Ability to work in a high stress environment. Independence, maturity, computer skills, circumventing the rules, learning to seek out problems and solutions, ability to persuade, ability to create, ability to work productively with difficult people. That is a very valuable skill. But my favorite, one woman wrote, grad school gave me the ability and courage to start something, even if you didn't know how yet. And when I read her words, it really struck me that that was what made the grad school experience so exceptional and so different. Because, you know, I had friends who've gone on to, like, you know, out of college, gone straight into careers, and then I have subsequently gone back to get an MBA, so I can directly compare and contrast the PhD experience to these other experiences. One of the things you notice right away is in these other professional school environments, the schools are much nicer. You know, the chairs are much more comfortable. It's a much posher environment. And that's the irony, is that in a lot of other environments, you are given curriculum and you have to master the curriculum. And if you master the curriculum, you get a degree and then you go off and do whatever you want to do. But the PhD is very different. What they do to us in the PhD program is they literally march us to the precipice of human knowledge, literally to the edge of what is known and what is unknown. And then they tell you in your PhD, you have to take the next step. And they don't tell you how. And that, you know, great project that you and your advisor have talked about all summer long, you start working on the project and it doesn't work. And you discover that the real world is full of unknown challenges and resource limitations and the need to be creative and solve problems that nobody's ever solved before. And in fact, that is what the real world is much more is like. In fact, the experience of doing a PhD is very similar to the experience of starting a company. It's why I often find some of the most successful entrepreneurs to be PhDs. But this idea that you're embarking on something that's new and unknown is something that I think a lot of physics-trained people fail to appreciate, of how unique this challenge is and how important this challenge is in shaping not just your worldview, but what you think you can do in the future. And I will say again, as I interviewed employers across all sorts of sectors, I found that they were very hungry for people with our types of skills and qualities. So while I was feeling very worried in graduate school, by the time I was doing my postdoc, I realized that the challenge was actually how to figure out where to go and find the right opportunities for myself. Now, if everything I said just now was you know, all there was to it, we PhDs and, you know, we physicists would be running the world. And I don't know if you've been noticing recently, but we are certainly not running the world. And so one of the challenges that we encounter when we come out of the academic world is that the outside world has some misperceptions about us. And, you know, if your name with PhD at the end of it or PhD in physics comes across somebody's desk one day who's not familiar with academia, what do you think the image is that is conjured in their mind? Well, it's something like this. Now, this might seem to be a terrible and offensive caricature. And we can look at our little friend here and see that he has no unwashed hair, he has a pocket protector, no watch, no sense of deadlines, unsophisticated. But look up here at that thought bubble. Very, very smart. People see PhD at the end of your name, and they will always assume that you are a genius. They will assume that you are a rocket scientist. They will assume that you are the next incarnation of Einstein. In fact, they will assume that you are a lot smarter than we know you actually are. And that's the funny thing about a PhD, is on the one hand, nobody is going to question your intelligence. Nobody is going to question your ability to solve problems or to work hard. Those are very positive aspects of the PhD. But the stuff that people sometimes worry about is literally the superficial stuff. Literally that you don't know how to dress. Literally that you can't communicate professionally. Literally that you don't want to work with other people. And so that's the sort of irony about PhDs exploring the broader world of work, is that in some respects the bar is set so low for us that if you simply show up like exhibiting bilateral symmetry and the ability to hold a conversation, it's amazing how much you will impress people. And so I think that one of the key concerns people have is, how do I show up in the quote unquote real world in a way that's professional, that's convincing, but I retain, my identity as a scientist. Now, while the outside world's perception of us as scientists is one of the challenges that we may face and need to overcome, I think the bigger challenges I've seen for PhDs is internal challenges, beliefs about themselves. And I call this collectively the curse of being smart. Because, for example, while we become very highly skilled through all these years of doing our science and doing our research and taking our classes, we tend to value our technical skills as the most important thing, the most valuable thing about us. In fact, we get so obsessed with our technical background and skills that we don't even consider any other job except for one that calls for our technical skills as being worth our time. We're also really, really smart, which means we can conceptualize, which means we can conceive of complications to our actions. And I've seen this over and over again, where smart people, because they're so smart, can overthink issues. They can sit there and say, well, I could take that postdoc, but then my probability of getting a job would drop by 33%, blah, blah, blah. And you can go through and kind of try to calculate out every element of probability in your career. Don't do it. Because in fact, there's no way for you to know the total possible range of outcomes for you as an individual. And rather than think about stuff, one of the things I find that by thinking too much, sometimes people act not very, they don't act enough. They don't act as quickly as they should. Another thing I've seen is that the academic world teaches you that you should be an expert, that you should know it all. And in fact, that's what we're teaching you to do in the PhD. We're teaching you to become a subject matter expert, the world's expert on some vanishingly thin and very narrow subject. Now, the problem about that ethos is that you cannot possibly be an expert in everything. And in the real world, you're going to have to encounter a ton of stuff that you have no background and experience in. And if you've been taught in grad school that you have to be the expert in something before you can be, engage in it, then you're not going to have a lot of options for yourself. People who are trained in the academic world and trained as PhDs sometimes really get uncomfortable when they get put in a situation where they are the dummy, where they don't know the basics of something. And then people tend to avoid it. People tend to stick to their scientific expertise, to their discipline, because that's where they feel comfortable, that's where they feel validated. But again, one of the key processes, not just of being a successful individual, but even being a successful scientist, is being willing to venture into other areas where you are not the expert, where you have to be the dummy, where you have to, instead of talking, stop and ask questions. It actually is intellectually a very healthy shift to make, but it's very hard for PhDs to do. We are intellectually smart. I think that means that we often fail to appreciate that there are other forms of smart. There are very successful people throughout the world today who have never gotten a college degree, let alone a PhD, who have intelligence in lots of other ways besides just academic or intellectual or quantitative intelligence. These people who have the ability to conjure stories and motivate other people, those parts of intelligence are very valuable in the world, but they're not very valued in academia. And as a result, we tend to sometimes look down on those other people. And then finally, we're used to being exceptional. And I think that means that we often get very frightened of the possibility of failure. You know, we work so hard as an undergrad and a graduate student. We spent so many years, our parents are so proud of us that we don't dare do something or go off in a direction that has risk that might be a failure for us. As a result, I think PhD trained people can be very kind of conservative, and they can be very nervous about making even a side shift into another field of science. And yet that willingness to risk, that willingness to take a big step is often what makes the difference, even in a scientific career. And so this fear of failure can sometimes really inhibit you to the point where the aggregate of what you do in your career ends up being very modest. So that's what I feel is the curse of being smart. Now, as I said, over the years, I have met a wide variety of people who have had PhDs in one field and then moved on to another field. And in fact, this has been one of the most interesting set of conversations I've had, because most of the time when you get a PhD in physics, you tend to assume that your career is going to remain in physics for some point the rest of your life. And so I have met all these people. So this is a mixed up list here. You can see a list on the left is the PhD subject that this person got, and on the right is their current or recent position. And you could look at this list on the left and list on the right and ask yourself, what's the most likely link between the PhD on the left and the job on the right? And I know that some of these look, suspicious, like, oh yeah, the astrophysicist, financial analyst, or the, I don't know, the medieval historian with the Secretary of Defense. I know that those things look like possible matches, but the fact is that the people I met had made some pretty big jumps from the PhD environment that they had grown up in to the job they were in today. And I think this is really an interesting thing for PhDs to think about, is that I know that you, having spent all the years studying physics, maybe even getting your PhD or postdoc in physics, you feel like physics is the only thing you're qualified to do. But these people here who I have met have, through a series of often unexpected circumstances, found themselves on the path to do something completely and totally different. Like Angela Merkel, who at one point was a theoretical chemist in East Germany and is now the Chancellor of Germany. You never know where your career could potentially take you. Now, I will agree, not every theoretical chemist becomes the Chancellor of Germany. It's not like the probability of any one outcome is particularly high. But I think that the fallacy that we operate on, having grown up in an academic world, is that we think that what we have done for our undergraduate and graduate, that subject matter is what defines us, and that the rest of our life will be kind of normally distributed around like our PhD thesis topic. And that is not true. That is not true. In fact, you have the potential to do a huge, wide range of things. But the first decision you have to make is that you're willing to consider that. All these people who I met, they did have one thing in common. They were smart. They were really, really smart people, just like you. And that's the funny thing, is all those people on this list on the left, they were grad students once, just like you. They suffered finishing their PhD, just like you. And yet they've gone on to do a wide variety of different things. So I think that this is one critical lesson. You are likely to be one of the main reasons why you're limiting your options, because you don't think that you can do a wider variety of things. Toward the end of my fourth year, I guess, in grad school, a funny thing happened to me. I was at Stanford in the School of Earth Sciences, and our school, like many departments and many universities, has an external advisory board, right? These are a group of outside experts, usually very senior people, usually all men, who come every year or two into your department, and they walk around for a day or two, and they basically evaluate the department and give the leadership advice. And this was the case at Stanford. In fact, in my 4th year, I didn't know this at the time, but there was a big meeting of our external advisory board. And as I said, most of the external advisory board were like very senior people, but they had done something unusual. They had brought a new person onto the external advisory board, and this person had a very different demographic than most of the other people. First of all, they were young. They had gotten their PhD only 12 years earlier, and they got it from Stanford, which was also unusual to have somebody from your department come back so soon. And in 12 years, this person had risen very high in Chevron Corporation. So by the time they invited this person back, they were, I think, executive vice president for exploration geophysics for Southeast Asia. It was a big job. Like, when I say big job, this person was probably responsible for between $2 and $4 billion of research and exploration investment. So that is a big job. And again, unbeknownst to me at the time, when they invited her back, apparently she had a conversation with the dean. And she said, yeah, I'll come back. I'll join this this committee and give you guys some advice, but I have one request, one requirement. And the dean said, yes. And she said, I want to come back, but I want to have a private off-the-record lunch just with the graduate students. Can you arrange that for me? And the dean said, well, sure. Yeah, I think we can do that. And, you know, us graduate students, all we knew is that the dean's office was inviting us to free lunch. And we're like, hey, free lunch, sure. So we come in the room, and there's this person. We sit down, and for the next 90 minutes, we have one of the most riveting conversations I'd ever had in grad school. Because this person was now in a very different environment than we were in. And she had all sorts of practical advice for us. She talked to us, for example, about what classes she wished she had taken differently at Stanford. She told us about what her week was like. She told us what life was like in the industrial world. Now, part of why she was there was she was recruiting, right? And that was an important thing that she had to do. But what she also was doing was opening our eyes as grad students to these different environments in which you could do work. And at the end of the lunch, I somewhat, admittedly, somewhat glibly asked her if she had a formula for success. And she answered right away. She said, absolutely. It's the 80-10-10 rule. And I said, I don't know what the 80-10-10 rule. Could you explain it to me? She said, sure. She said, 80% of my work week, I try to focus on the most important problems in front of me. She said, you know, she looked around the table at all of us, and she said, you know, all of you have been very successful students so far. And one of the ways in which you've been a successful student is you've always done all your homework, right? Every assignment, you've always done it to completion, right? And we nodded. And she said, guess what? In the real world, if you take that strategy, you will absolutely be buried. She looked around the table. She said, in the real world, you will be handed more work than you have hours to do. There's literally too much work coming at you. And what you need to learn how to do is not to try to be more efficient and do all that work. You need to learn how to actively blow off some of this work. Don't do some of your job. I'm like, wow, don't do your homework. Man, that's deep. She said, look, the most important thing is for you to focus on the most valuable problems. That's what I do at Chevron. I look through the things that I'm working on and ask myself, which of these problems has the potential to deliver the best value to Chevron? I'm going to focus on those problems. And a lot of this other stuff that people are telling me to do, well, you know what? I'm going to sometimes not do it. And yeah, occasionally I'll get into trouble, but mostly what will happen is I will make more progress on the important issues, and that'll be more important to my management than not having done something here on the side. 10% of my work week, she then said, I spend solely focused on my own personal and professional development. I close my door, my secretary holds my calls, I read outside my field. I visit people in finance at Chevron. I visit people in finance at Morgan Stanley, not because it has anything to do with my current job or my current projects, but solely to give myself more information, more knowledge and insight about what's going on around me. I spend half a day a week in that exploration, the curiosity-driven exploration mode. And I do it because I find new stuff. And she said, if you choose just to do your job, That'll be great for you and for your supervisor, but you won't necessarily have the time to discover something new and important. And then I raised my hand and said, so what's the final 10%? She said, oh, well, the final 10% of my work week, I try to tell as many people as possible what a good job I'm doing the 80% of the time I am doing my job. And we all sort of laughed. And she said, look, you know, you think that what you're doing is valuable, and you think what you're doing is evident to everybody around you. Guess what? People don't know. Even people in your department don't really know what you're doing or why it's valuable. You need to tell people. You need to proactively communicate not just what you're doing, but why you think it's important. That's what that final 10% of your time should be. Communicating to other people about what is important, why you are doing it, and also what you need. 80-10-10 rule. I walked out of that lunch, took an extra sandwich, of course, because, hey, I'm a grad student. But I walked back to my desk and I realized that, you know, in a month in grad school, maybe what this means is that 2 days out of the month, I should sneak out of the department. Maybe I should go over to the business school and sit in on a lecture by somebody from Uber. I mean, I'm not doing any research related to Uber, but it just was interesting to me. And maybe 2 days out of the month, I should get out off this campus and I should go out and meet people and find out what various careers are like. That was the 80-10-10 rule, and that was some of the best advice I ever received, which is why I always share it with people. Because, you know, there are skills that will really matter to you no matter what career path you're on, whether you're a faculty member at a university or whether you are the CEO of a tech company. Skills like leadership, persuasion, humor, tact, understanding of risk and reward, understanding of investment return, organization, sensitivity, drive, perspective, and creativity. Now, I know you look at these things and you say, well, these are qualities, these aren't skills, and that is not true. In fact, one of the things I learned after leaving the academy and being involved in business is that all of these subjects I listed here are acquirable skills in the same way you can learn Python or Tagalog or you know, rug weaving. These things can be taught and these things can be learned. And the reason I bring this up to you as you are sitting in this workshop with me in this, you know, early part of your career is that I think that it's easy for grad students to kind of feel like, well, some of the stuff is going to either come naturally to me or it's going to come accidentally through some accidental opportunity that I have. Guess what? You could, even as a graduate student, engineer and have your department or university organize a short course on any one of these subjects. You can acquire these skills. And I'll tell you, when I've shown hiring managers this list, they have said, give me 10 people who have all these skills and I could do anything. And that's my point, is that even after grad school, it's very important for you to keep acquiring new skills, keep acquiring experience, and think about the things that you think you'll need to get ahead. Now, I know that you probably signed up to this workshop thinking, okay, I've got to get a job soon. So what about the job search, you know? And I know that it's very easy to get very preoccupied thinking about like, well, what am I going to do next? How am I going to make that step? And they're very typical questions that, you know, early career scientists ask, like, how do I get a job in, you know, fill in the blank, intellectual property law or academia or national lab? How do I write a resume? What jobs call for my skills? I'm a chemist. I'm a geochemist. I'm a biogeochemist. I'm a microbiogeochemist. What jobs call for those people? Or where's the bathroom? I'm going to be sick. Admittedly, it's a very stressful time. But there are better questions. Questions such as, what do I enjoy doing and what am I good at? What are various careers like? What careers and jobs are a good match to my skills, interests, and values? And probably the most important question of all, who can I talk to? Why are these questions better? Well, for starters, as I've explained, I think scientists and engineers, and physicists in particular, tend to be preoccupied with matching technical skills. And we tend to ignore a lot of the other important factors that are important in choosing a career. Like, for example, Where do you want to live? Around the United States or around the world? Where would you like to live? Have you ever thought about it? Have you ever thought, like, God, I'd love to live in San Diego, or, oh, I never ever want to live in Texas? These questions, like where you want to live, do I want to live in a city? Do I want to live away from a city? These things are very important to your happiness. And frankly, your happiness is very important to your career success. And yet we tend to tell early career scientists and engineers that the most important thing is to get that right job, that next postdoc, whatever it is, no matter where it is, and work your way through science, et cetera, and move. But that might not be the right advice for everybody. I will also say that we scientists and engineers lack information and exposure to other career fields. You know, the ivory tower that they say we live in, this academic ivory tower, it's a very good metaphor, because frankly, you know, it's very rare that people not in a research you know, kind of community come and visit us or give us a lecture about what their life is like. That's why I found that 80-10-10 lecture so profound. And also, I will admit that career change for scientists and engineers can be harder. And it can be harder because, you know, there's this lack of an established pathway. You have these tracks in science that are very clear: undergrad, grad school, postdoc, postdoc, postdoc. And all this other stuff I've talked about, there's no clear path. And so it can be very unsettling. And, you know, it is also unsettling for people to feel like they spent all these years investing in getting a physics PhD or a physics degree, and now they're quote unquote not going to use it. Oh, it's all wasted. And as I've said to you already, I have found in my very eclectic career that I use my science and everything I've learned almost every day. And finally, I will say there is ignorance and even fear of life in the quote unquote real world, you know, where people show up to work every day. And grad school's nice. You know, you can work any 80 hours of the week you want. You can kind of come to work, dress the way you want. You know, the hours are long, but the pay is low, so it kind of balances out. But look, friends, if you don't like what you do for a living, you probably won't be very good at it. I call that Fisk's rule. And the corollary of Fisk's rule, which is also Fisk's rule, if you love what you are doing, you will probably be awesome at it, including science. So this is where, you know, I have to reiterate, nothing what I've said so far is about telling you that you should abandon your dream of being a scientist. Because for many of us, we still love that dream and we still want to realize that dream. I'm just saying there can be some pretty interesting and unexpected pathways for you, and ways in which you can also do meaningful work without necessarily following this canonical pathway that you think lies ahead. Now, one of the common things I encounter when working with early career scientists and engineers is a lot of people tend to focus on the job search, that career development equals job search. And this job search, the process of getting a job, the resume, interviews, all that stuff, that's certainly part of career planning and career management, but it is not what all of career planning is about. In fact, the most important parts of career planning and career strategy have nothing to do with the actual job search. They actually start with some foundational activities, the first of which is called self-assessment. Literally, not looking for a job, but rather understanding yourself and understanding your skills, interests, and values. And along with that self-assessment is another foundational activity, which is also not looking for a job, which is called exploration, which is that habit, that curiosity-driven habit of looking around in the world and asking yourself, what's out there, what interests me, and where can I go and who can I talk to? Those two habits, self-assessment and exploration, pretty much differentiate successful career trajectories from modest career trajectories. That habit, we'll talk a lot more about those two steps in the second half of the workshop. Those two habits are absolutely critical to people making progress in their careers. Now, there is a certain point at which you need to make a career transition. Maybe it's a transition that you see coming, you know, for years ahead, like the end of your PhD or the end of your postdoc. Sometimes there are career transitions that are a complete surprise to you, like you're being denied tenure, or your division is going through layoffs. Then you have to go through a process of focusing, which is now making the connection between all your preparation and what you've done before and the specific scenarios and specific pathways to get you to the next thing that you want to do. Seen in completion, the career planning process is both foundational activities and tactical activities you do in the course of moving your career forward. Certainly resumes and interviews are a critical element of that, but as you'll see, as we move forward in this workshop, we're going to be talking a lot more about some of the foundational activities, because this is often the stuff that people skip. So let's talk about this foundational activity called self-assessment, this idea of self-analysis. It really comes down to several very specific activities that you can engage in. There's informal methods, including just brainstorming and journaling. There are self-guided methods, including interest exercises, and there are even formal methods, exams and tests that you can take. The bottom line here is each of you is bizarre and weird and neurotic and different in some special way, right? And so if you don't understand the things that make you special, your superpower, right? You won't be able to give a clear definition of what you will be best at doing. It's like in this, the superhero movies, it's a common trope that early on in the superhero's life, they don't quite understand their superpower. They don't quite know how to command it. And in fact, in some cases, it kind of creates tremendous disruption and destruction in their life until they figure out how to use it. I think that's the same way with self-assessment. Each of you has a superpower or a set of superpowers, and it's important for you to get definition on it. And that's what the self-assessment process does. Now, when I said initial brainstorming, there are really some activities like simply asking yourself questions like, what do I enjoy doing most? What do I like most and least about my present career? What are my values? What do I like to read? What organizations or jobs sound interesting to me? When have I been my happiest at work? When have I been my most unhappy? Now, these can sometimes be sensitive questions. But when I was in my 4th year in grad school, I got some really great advice from Al Levin. He said, you should start a career development journal. And this is literally nothing more than a spiral notebook. And into that spiral notebook, write down the answers to questions like this. Sit in a cafe for an hour or two and just give yourself a chance to write down some of your thoughts about these questions. And when you go to an interesting lecture, maybe in the business school, take the notes in the same journal. When you go on an informational interview, take your notes in the same journal. The reason, he said, is that this process of kind of initial brainstorming can be very unstructured and can sometimes feel very unproductive. One of the things he observed is people who do this journaling process, after a couple weeks and months, as you page through the things you've written, you begin to see patterns emerge in what you have observed. And those patterns lead you to certain insights about where you should be looking. There are also self-guided exercises. My books have a number of these self-guided exercises. And here's one that I like a lot that we typically do live when we are doing one of our career workshops at the APS meeting. And that is make a 2-column list of everything that you can think of that you like and dislike about the academic career, and then assign priorities. In other words, rank them. What do you learn about your values, interests, and skills as they affect the work in the workplace? And so, for example, things I love about the research career, I love the intellectual challenge. I loved the opportunity to teach. I really enjoyed teaching. I like the flexible work schedule, the independence, the smart colleagues. I loved learning new things, collaborating. Those were things I loved about the research career. But there were some things I definitely did not like. I did not like the long hours. I definitely did not like the low pay. I was an experimental scientist, so I was often isolated for hours and hours building and trying to make something work. I was very nervous about the funding rat race. I didn't like the politics of academia, the arrogant colleagues, and the lack of teamwork. So this is my list. And what's interesting about this exercise is when we have gone through on the workshop and we have done this exercise, in many cases, people have general kind of agreements that, yeah, a lot of people like the independence, a lot of people like learning new things, and not very many people like the low pay and the isolation. So in a general sense, we tend to share some of the things we enjoy and share the things that we don't like. But the important part of this exercise is there's a second step, and that is that you rank these things. And what we've found is that while people may have general agreements about what they like and dislike, for each individual, their rankings are almost always unique to themselves. So here's me and my list and ranked order of things I enjoy and things I don't like about a research career. Maybe sitting right next to me is this person. She loves teaching the most, and she loves the flexible work schedule and the independence, the intellectual challenge, smart colleagues. But what she doesn't like is the lack of teamwork. She really would prefer an environment where teaching was important, where she was working as part of a team. Maybe she should consider a teaching career at more of a smaller college as opposed to a research university, or maybe she should look at places where teaching is valued in the business sector, for example, in training or technical support. And sitting next to her is this person. This person loves the independence and the intellectual challenge. She actually likes the politics in the academic world, learning new things. What she doesn't like is the low pay and the arrogant colleagues. Maybe she should be thinking about ways in which she could spin out her research and to start her own company. 3 different grad students, all very successful grad students, but different people. And this is one of the key things that I'd like to emphasize in self-assessment, is it's very common for you to look at the very traditional academic pathway of grad school, postdoc, et cetera, and think that everybody should be locked into that. But that pathway might be good for only a small subset of the people getting PhDs today. There may be other pathways that are better suited to you, that would make you happier and potentially more successful. These differences in what we like and what we don't like are absolutely critical for you to understand, because they often define whether you're happy and successful in your career. Here's another exercise I like a lot, and I like it not just for its role in self-assessment, but I also find it can be very useful to you when you come to prepare yourself for interviews for a job. And the exercise goes like this. Think back over the experiences you've had in your life in the areas of work, leisure, or learning, and pick 3 to 10 of these experiences that have the following characteristics. First, you were the chief or a significant player. 2, you regard this event as a huge success. You did something, created something, achieved something that's really significant, and other people would say, you know, that's definitely a good thing. And the third element is that you truly enjoyed yourself while this thing was going on. Okay, so think back on your life at those events that have those 3 characteristics. Then sit down, pull out your career development journal or some other piece of paper and write several paragraphs about this. Detail the experience, talk about what you encountered, what you did, and most importantly, why you found it so satisfying. Now, counselors and cognitive psychologists have looked back on these experiences, and these are experiences that we commonly refer to as people being in the zone. These have been moments in their life when they have been like hugely productive, and in like it's like time stands still because you're just like totally in the zone. All right, those things are very telling. Those moments are very telling because they can reveal some of the common characteristics of where you do your best work. And when I've done this exercise in like APS meetings, it's been very interesting because after people journal for about 15 or 20 minutes and we look back on what they've written, some people notice clear patterns right away. Like somebody notices that every one of the experiences they were working by themselves. That's very important to realize. Or another person sitting right next to them says every one of the experiences were things where they were leading a team. That's very important. See, these past experiences where we've been successful and done great work tell us about the moments and the environments in which we're most productive. And that's very valuable. Now, finally, there are other formal methods for self-assessment, a variety of online instruments. And these are some of the ones that I have used in my career. Many of you are familiar with the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which talks about different personality types. But the one that I often really direct people to is this thing called the Strong Interest Inventory. It is a very interesting exercise because rather than looking at your personality type, it just looks at your interests. What interests you? And it asks you a bunch of questions, and then it takes your answers and compares them to people in a variety of different career fields. And then it actually gives you answers about which people in which different career fields have interests that are similar to yours. I find that just really an interesting kind of mode to have your answers to the strong interest inventory compared to people in different careers. And you can see some surprising links come up. Another one that I like a lot is this thing at the bottom called Strength Finder. This is an instrument that was developed by the Gallup organization to simply focus on you identifying what you are best at, your strengths. And you can do this Strength Finder through this book, which you can buy on Amazon, called Now Discover Your Strengths. And the basic thesis and theory behind this is that a strength is the ability to provide consistent, near perfect performance in a specific activity. And in particular, an activity that leaves you feeling strong. In other words, this is like being in the zone. These are things you do that you enjoy doing, you do them well, and you feel energized by doing them. And they make the point that a strength is sort of the combination of some innate talent that you might have with skill and knowledge and experience. And so the book goes through and asks you a bunch of questions, and the online instrument does, and then it sorts you into, it gives you a sense for which out of these 34 kind of strengths that they define, which are your top 5 strengths. And you know, it's really sometimes illuminating, because I think that sometimes when we think about ourselves and think about what we're good at, we tend to struggle to find words to describe it. And this instrument's very helpful because it gives you a sense for what your strengths are and then gives you a specific term and a way to describe it to other people. And that can be very valuable. I'll also point out that there are some online resources, including AAAS still has the Science Careers website up, and the IDP portion of the Science Careers website has a number of these career development instruments available to you for free. And so this is a way that you can get like a Myers-Briggs-like thing for free. I'll also point out that there's some other interesting publications coming out looking at science careers. This is one that came out 5 years ago, but I thought it was very interesting because it was a very exhaustive survey of career outcomes for PhDs and earnings. And in particular, they surveyed thousands of PhDs and found that there was a very interesting spectrum of places where PhDs went. Many PhDs end up in larger companies because larger companies tend to have R&D and sort of R&D-ish like activities that PhDs would be suitable for. And so PhDs end up disproportionately going to large companies. And also there was a big difference in earnings between academia and government and industry. So these 3 curves shows you the earnings, and you can see that the academic and government jobs tend to, you know, kind of be in this 50,000. This is 2015 data, so it's probably a little shifted, but not that much. But you see in industry, you tend to have PhDs earning much higher levels. And so if you want a raise and money and kind of salary is important to you and your family, industry definitely is a key differentiator in that regard. So self-assessment is the process of looking inward. Exploration is the process of venturing outward. And as I said before in that 80-10-10 rule, some of this is just habit, like keeping your eyes and ears open, reading the newspaper, talking to people, browsing the web, taking the time to go hear an outside speaker, even though you're very, very busy with all your experiments at the lab. Another way to explore is actually to build your skills base, because in academia, as well as in many professional scientific societies, there is a way for you to explore to see whether a field might interest you, which is by taking a short course. Sometimes in some universities, you can take individual short courses at different departments and different schools. And at technical meetings, they sometimes have workshops the day before the technical sessions. And APS does this, where they have an entire day of many, many different workshops where you can get a deep dive on a very specific subject and get schooled in what's current in a certain field. But the most important most important way to explore the world of work is to build your network. Now, whenever I get to the quote unquote networking portion of my workshop, I often can sense a degree of, I don't know, dread coming across the audience, because a lot of people have heard about this networking thing, and a lot of people find it, very intimidating, honestly. And so I want to start by kind of defining networking in a term that I think is both accurate and much more helpful for you. And that is, networking is simply developing relationships with people. That's all it is, developing relationships with people. And in particular, people who share your professional and personal interests. So that's all it is developing relationships with people who share your interests. And from time to time, alerting them to your career goals and abilities. That's all it is. It's relationships with people. It is not tiresome schmoozing for a job. It's not restricted, slick, and superficial people. In fact, I find that slick and superficial people can sometimes not be very effective networkers. You know why? Because they don't come across very genuine, and thus they can't form the sort of bonds where conversations can take place easily. So networking is just about making relationships with people. So as a young scientist, you have been networking throughout your career. You probably just didn't call it that, right? When you go out to dinner, for example, with the journal club speaker who comes to your department, hey, sure, it's free dinner, but it's also an opportunity to meet this person and learn about their department or where they're coming from, and that's networking. Poster sessions, right, are a perfect example of a networking opportunity. You sit there for 3 hours at this huge hall in the American Physical Society annual meeting, and you sit there with your little obscure result in this enormous hall with thousands of other people. And what happens is some people come by and they were interested in your abstract, and they show up and they ask you questions, and you talk for like an hour. That's networking, and it's very important and very valuable for a scientific career. So if networking is simply having relationships with people, then who's in your network? It's anybody you know and feel comfortable asking a specific favor from to be part of your network. And that's my definition. It's not just people you know, but people you know well enough that you can ask a specific favor from. And these could be schoolmates, recent graduates, collaborators, friends from high school or college, past bosses and colleagues, family, people you meet at seminars, workshops, and conferences, other people who are looking for jobs. But most importantly, it's not just the people you know, but it's the people they know. This is why software and things like LinkedIn are so valuable and so important for you, especially early in your career. Because LinkedIn, for example, enables you to put together a profile, but also enables you to link to other people. Think about it this way. You know who your friends are, right? But you don't know who your friends know, right? There's no way you could know all your friends' friends, which means that your friends may have somebody that they know that can be helpful to you in your career search. It turns out that 70% of business connections, 70% of job opportunities come through this friends of friends, this network of people that you know. And this is why these tools are very valuable, is that these tools like LinkedIn help you see who your friends know. And with your friend, you can get introductions. Now, when I said my definition of networking involves being able to ask a favor, what do I mean by that? I mean, you are comfortable enough to reach out to this person in your network and ask for help. For example, please introduce me to so-and-so who I see is in your network. Or please forward my resume or latest reprint, et cetera. Or please provide a reference for me as so-and-so calls. Or can you tell me the latest about some particular topic? Or can you send me the copy of some report or something? These are specific favors, often relevant to your career search, and your network is a group of people you feel comfortable asking favors from. The most valuable people in your network are those who are already established in the career field that interests you and who are willing to give you help. So for example, if you end up deciding one day intellectual property law is what you want to do, you're very curious about it, but you don't know anybody, the way you use your network is you go through all these people you know and you ask them, hey, I noticed that you have a friend from college who's now working at an intellectual property law firm. Would you be willing to introduce me? And of course, your friend would say, of course, you'd love to meet Karen. She's fabulous. You guys will really hit it off. And that's how people find opportunities. This is the same case in academia. Peter Fiske wrote this wonderful book, A PhD is Not Enough. And I still think it's great reading for anybody embarking on a science career. And he writes in the book, the best preparation you can make towards the goal of having an academic career is to find yourself a research aunt or uncle, someone with little or no authority over you, who has the experience to act as a sounding board and a giver of accurate advice. Do not be afraid to go outside and get to know people outside your advisor's realm. And I would say this is a really important lesson for graduate students. It is absolutely critical for you to begin building research collaborations, even as a graduate student, preferably with people outside your university, but at least people outside your advisors group. Those research collaborations are how people grow their careers. And for you postdocs, I recommend that 25% of your research as a postdoc should be with involving researchers outside the current institution you're in, because that is how you grow your scientific pathway, is by having research collaborations. So I also think this advice might be a little awkward because we have canceled the spring APS meeting, but when you go to scientific meetings are themselves very important networking events. They're very valuable, and there can be some very specific tactics you can employ to maximize the value of your presence at a meeting. I call that working a meeting. So here's some things I think about when I go to a technical meeting. First of all, who might you want to connect with while at the APS meeting? I look through abstracts, I look in sessions that interest me. If there are particular companies that are going to be there, I want to figure out who they are, and then I reach out to those people in advance. I send them an email, I say, hey, I see you're going to come to the APS meeting, I'd like to meet you, maybe Tuesday for coffee. Another way is to simply wait till their session happens and then go up and introduce yourself after their talk, or go to their poster. You should be clear about what you're seeking. Maybe it's just information, maybe it's just technical advice, maybe it's insight, or maybe it's something specific. Do not be afraid to go up to people and say, hey, I'm finishing up at Purdue in a year, and I am thinking about a postdoc as my next step. I'm very interested in your research. Can I learn more about it? That proactive approach makes a very positive impression. Do share with people the time frame of your transition. It's helpful if people know when you're going to be making this transition. And also make sure that you get the opportunity to be introduced to other people. So when you meet this person, ask them, is there anybody else in the department who you recommend I should talk to? It's always good to ask for advice. People are very forthcoming. And then follow up with a brief thank you. And if you had some next steps that you were going to do with this person, make sure you follow up with those next steps. So I find at a meeting that there'll typically be 10 to 20 people that I identify that I want to talk to. And by the way, that makes the meeting very productive because I have conversations with every one of them if I can. I also visit the exhibits booths because it's very interesting to go to an exhibits booth, even at the APS meeting, and just see and meet PhDs who are now working on the business side. Oftentimes, those PhDs will be the people in the booth. And you can just ask them questions like, how did you make the transition from your PhD to where you're working now, like MATLAB, for example? What was the hardest thing? What's your advice? What was the most important advice you got? These are great questions to ask people. And frankly, the people at the exhibits booths love talking to other people. So it's often interesting to just find out what they're doing in their company. You can see somebody's badge and it says, Mary Landry is a technical field representative. It's like, what is that? Go up and ask Mary. Mary, what is a technical field representative? Tell me what you do and tell me how you use your physics in the course of that work. Great questions, great conversations await you. Also, bear in mind that long before a job is advertised, companies do know what possibilities exist for growth and hiring. So do not be afraid to just ask them, like, what are the areas of growth in the next 12 months? Sometimes people can be surprisingly candid. They will give you specific advice. They'll say, oh, guess what? We have a big $50 million program proposal with NASA and Northrop Grumman. And if we get that, project, we're going to be hiring probably 25 physical scientists. So let me, take your information and I'll be happy to stay in touch with you. That means that you're an insider. That means you've got an insight as to something that might be going down in the future. Years and years ago, in the New Yorker magazine, this cartoon appeared early in the days of the internet. It's probably older than some of you on this call today. Two dogs are sitting by a terminal, and one of them says, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And I think similarly, on the internet, nobody knows that you're a lowly graduate student. And I find that graduate students can pursue people on the internet in a way that seems a little awkward. So let me give you some advice here. You've got an e-persona. This is what I call all the information about you on the internet. Some of the content is stuff you control, and some of the stuff is content you don't control. Facebook is what we use for friends. Many of you probably have Facebook pages, although an increasing number of you, including my kids, don't even bother with Facebook. LinkedIn is the most common professional edifice or presentation that people have. And LinkedIn is used by everybody. Then, often in academia, people have research groups, and that research group has a website. I think it's great to post your papers. I think it's great to post a brief bio that describes your background and experience, but I recommend that you never, ever, ever post your resume or your CV. Don't post it on your group's website. Don't post it on Monster or anything like that. And here's why. Your CV or your resume is a very important marketing document. And by necessity, it needs to be tailored to the specific opportunity you are pursuing. If you post a CV or a resume, first of all, if you post a CV, it's going to make you look like one thing, and that is an academic. And it's fine to present your academic credentials, but I recommend you do it in the form of a bio, not posting a CV. Also, I do recommend that you do what I call the vanity Google, which is from time to time going and just Googling your name and just seeing what comes up. And the reason I recommend this is that this is what employers will do. When we have you as a shortlisted candidate for a position, we absolutely Google your name. We take the other information from your resume and we try to find you. And we find all sorts of stuff. For example, if you Google Peter Fiske, you will find lots of stuff. You'll find images of me at various stages in my life, but I am not the only Peter Fiske out there. There are other Peter Fiskes. And whereas this Peter Fiske here is talking to you today and is an expert in career development for scientists and works at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, there's another Peter Fiske, including this Peter Fiske, who also lives in San Francisco, but is one of the leaders in the whipping and branding community. So just be aware of where sometimes your namesakes exist, because there can be sometimes some awkward experiences where you are mistaken for another person. For example, this other Peter Fiske. But this is the Peter Fiske who's talking to you today. And this is I think it's now an older version of my LinkedIn site. And I strongly recommend that you spend the time to build your LinkedIn profile, because this is the most common way that people present themselves in the outside world. And it's a way for you to present all the information that would be present in a resume or CV, but you do it in a reverse chronological order that doesn't seem like you're looking for a job. It's more just representing your past achievements. And so you go in reverse chronological order with your experience. You can list skills, other people can endorse your skills. Of course, education is very much an important part of your background. Some people, this is not my site, this is not my LinkedIn page, but this is another colleague of mine who's done a very nice thing. He has listed key publications, and he did something really clever. In addition to listing the publications, he wrote not an abstract, but he wrote a general description of why this publication is significant. That would be helpful for somebody who's not necessarily in the industry to appreciate. And he also listed some of his patents. And then, of course, there are the LinkedIn groups. LinkedIn now has more than 1 million groups. These are people in all sorts of different environments talking about specific subjects. Sometimes there are LinkedIn groups on every company. There are organizations who have LinkedIn groups. LinkedIn groups are one of the most helpful ways for you to begin networking, especially if you are new to a field or new to a discipline. You can also find very interesting information on LinkedIn groups about companies or organizations that you might be applying to for employment. Lawrence Berkeley Lab, for example, has a LinkedIn group, as does the other national labs, and many universities do as well. There's going to be some very interesting gossip and insight that you can gain on these groups. One of the most important things also for you to consider is literally how you show up. These are some of my friends on LinkedIn, and I just find it interesting to reflect on their choices for how they decided to show themselves. Now, you have to understand, we are Homo sapiens, right? We are innately designed to pick up subtle cues based on how people look. So my friend Tatiana chose to do a nice black and white image of herself. My friend Michelle is in the Navy, and really it was important to her to show that side of herself. Our friend Rachel's a bench chemist, which you can certainly see there. And you don't have to have a professional do your photo, but a nice looking photo close in on your face is really a nice way to present yourself. So I simply say you don't have to like put on some professional airs or some persona that feels fake to you. Just be thoughtful about the image that you want to present in your e-persona. What professional face do you want to project? If you're a researcher interested in quarks, what sort of ways can you express that so that other people can find you? What would a potential funder think when they viewed your profile? What would a potential employer think when they viewed your LinkedIn profile? These are just some helpful questions for you to ask yourself. Now, final element, I'd say, of LinkedIn etiquette is how you use something like LinkedIn. Now, I will tell you practically every day I get a message like this. I'd like to connect with you on LinkedIn. Now, here's the problem. We are humans, right? We want to relate to other people. And so when I get a random message like this that's not very personal, my first inclination is to ignore it. So here's one little important piece of advice. If you want to use LinkedIn and you want to link to other people, personalize the outreach. Here's an example. Ahmed simply said, "Hi, Peter. It was great hearing you last week at the University of California. Thank you for your thought-provoking talk. I'd like to link in." So now I remember, oh, okay, I remember when I met this guy. Of course, I'd be happy to accept and link to this guy. And people can sometimes even ask me for advice. And if they have, approached me in a way that's nice and professional, not only can they give me, a good question, but I will sometimes respond. So here's an example of how I responded to Jonathan and gave him tips on his LinkedIn page. This gets back to the whole idea of networking. Networking is about making relationships with people so that you can ask for help and ask a favor. That's what networking is. So I have rules to link by. I try to never go generic when I send invitations. I try to avoid that automatic link to everyone in my contacts list, which is on the LinkedIn app. It can be very embarrassing. I also try to be timely. If you're going to seek somebody to link with, try to do it within the first 24 hours of meeting the person. And also think about why you want to develop a networking relationship with this person. I have rules. You don't have to have my rules, but my rules are I will always accept invites from people I've worked with, met in person, spoken on the phone, etc. And I will almost always accept invites from people not in the above category who provide me a cordial and clear explanation for why they want to link. So those are just my rules for you. Last thing, and then we're going to take a little break. One of the things that you may need to do from time to time is reach out to a quote unquote busy person, somebody who is got a lot on their plate, who's an important person, important for you to know, but because they're busy, they're going to be hard for you to connect with, especially if you're a stranger. So here's my advice for getting a meeting with a busy person. First of all, be persistent. One of the ways that busy people manage their time is they ignore a lot of the peripheral stuff, including questions from random people that they don't know or don't know very well. So be persistent. It is not a bad thing to be persistent. Also, think about how you can make it easy for them to respond to you or do what you need. You can say, I'll come to your office, home, whatever, and then sometimes consider what you can offer them as sort of an inducement, a way of reciprocity. I'd like to have coffee with you and pick your brain. In exchange, I will tell you everything I know about blank. But the number one advice is to be persistent. I know that it's common for grad students to get up the courage, or write an email to somebody they don't know. Dear Professor so-and-so, I'm very interested in blah, 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 paragraph 1. I blah, 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 paragraph 2, blah, 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 paragraph 3. And you write this long email to this person thinking, okay, this is enough information for them to make a decision. I recommend instead make quick questions, brief emails, and ask to follow up by phone. And then after you reach these people, thank them. Now, here's another little subtle piece of advice. Follow up a few months later. In fact, after you've had this brief informational interview with this person, go back and then put on your calendar 3 months from the date of your meeting with this person to follow up with just a brief email. Maybe the email simply says, hey, 3 months ago we met, you gave me some very valuable advice. Since that time, I've done this, that, and the other thing. And I really appreciate your advice. Thank you again very much. That second outreach to the person 3 months later is very sticky. You'll definitely stay in their minds. I mentioned this issue of a bio. A bio is simply a reverse chronological narrative description of your past achievements and history. It doesn't have to have a photo, mine do, and I recommend constructing bios of various lengths because you will use these bios all the time. A 1-paragraph bio you might use for people introducing you, 3-paragraph bio in preparation before an informational interview, and a 1-page bio, which can be more formal and more detailed. But I find that bios, unlike a resume or a CV, make you sound much more like a professional and much less like a desperate graduate student. Business cards, absolutely. Business cards are valuable. And I know that a lot of people in academia are like, well, I'm just a grad student. I don't know why I need a business card. You know why you need a business card? Because it's a simple act of courtesy. It's an act of courtesy because when you meet somebody and you introduce yourself, etc., you say your name, sometimes people don't hear it enough or they don't know how to reach out to you. If you give them a card, it simply is a small gesture saying, if for whatever reason you want to reach out to me in the future, here's a means to do so. It's just a very simple act of courtesy, and it's an indicator of professionalism. Now, I'm going to just wrap up and say that one of the things I always try to encourage early career scientists is that there are ways for you to build networking experiences for yourself. Here are 2 examples. At the University of California at Berkeley, the postdocs got together and created a new program by themselves called the Postdoc Industry Exploration Program. They realized that many of them were working on commercializable technologies, but they didn't have a background and experience to get advice. So they created this program with monthly day-long visits to local technology companies. They literally would get into a bus, go over to Apple or Google or Facebook or even another smaller company close by, and they'd spend the day as grad students learning about the business, asking questions, not because it related to their research, but solely on the basis of curiosity. They would have face-to-face meetings with management, tours of the facilities, and then a second program, the Berkeley Postdoc Entrepreneurship Program, were for the postdocs who were working on technologies that potentially were commercializable. They were seeking advice about how to commercialize or maybe even start their own companies. They had monthly evening workshops. They even created a network and resource center. Now, the reason I bring this up is that while you are still a grad student or a postdoc, you can create things to help you in your career search. Ask for advice, ask for help from your administration. And the process of building these programs can be extremely nourishing. They can be extremely helpful. They can provide you with leadership opportunities by simply creating something new in your department or in your university. And by the way, these people who created these two programs, they have credited their work to create these programs as being one of the factors that have led them to very exciting careers on their own. Okay, we are 2/3 of the way through our workshop. We go long, we go hard for a while, but we're going to take a 5-minute break. And at this point, I know a lot of you might want to stretch your legs. You may want to have a bio break. We're going to go for 5 minutes. But in this 5-minute time, I'm going to invite Crystal to come back on and share with us any questions that we will be you guys have written down so far. So Crystal, will you come back on the air and will you share with us any questions that people have written to you so far?
Hi, yes, hi Peter, absolutely. I'm happy to do that. We've already had some really, really excellent questions coming in throughout this first half or first 2/3 of the presentation. So actually pertinent to the thing you just talked about how you kind of keep a network connection fresh. I think you gave great advice, follow up, do that 3-month follow up, things like that. What do you do when you've already kind of let one of them grow cold? So this person said, they connected with somebody, a professor in the past. It was great, but then years went by, they never crossed paths again. And he feels a little bit awkward about reaching out. He's a little afraid that this person won't remember him. Do you have any advice?
Well, first, yes, so that's a great question. For starters, yes, of course they have forgotten you, right? So yes, of course. So what you do is you simply reach out with warmth and you say, dear Professor so-and-so, 3 years ago, I reached out to you and, either you had some exchange or you didn't, et cetera. Well, since that time, I have done this, that, and the other thing, and I'm reaching out to you again. I would really like to connect with you and discuss such and such. Would it be possible to schedule a quick phone call sometime in the next 2 weeks? Even though it's been 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, maybe they remember, but maybe they don't. But the fact is, the way that you improve the probability that they're willing to engage with you is by the warmth of your outreach. So be positive, be friendly, tell them, remind them if you had some encounter back, years back, what that encounter was. But also, potentially, if it was helpful to you, tell them that their advice back then was very, very useful and you're reaching out to them again. It's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Don't be afraid. Frankly, the worst thing that happens is you don't get a response. So if you don't get a response, cordially write them a quick email again, saying, hey, don't want to be a pest, but I would love to connect with you. Don't get a response, try one final time. 3 strikes. And if at the end of that 3rd email, hey, just, don't want to be a pest, but would really like to connect with you, at the end of that 3rd time, if you don't get a response, try to move on. So that's my advice for that. Thank you for that great question, Crystal.
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, for me, I think if I got an email from a student I worked with a couple years ago, I'd be kind of delighted.
Hey,
wow, this person's still thinking about me.
Yeah,
Cool.
That's great.
Yeah. Okay, second question. Back to the 80-10-10 rule. This is a old, further back in the presentation. The 10% of time that you mentioned where people should be talking to others about what, you should be really selling what you do.
Yeah.
Can you give some concrete examples of how someone might do that in a couple different contexts? Like maybe if you're a grad student, like what would that really look like?
Sure.
Yeah, okay.
So one of the things I will say, even within your department, it's like, a lot of people don't really know sometimes even what people are doing for their other people in their thesis. So work your way outward. First of all, be proactive and share with people what you're working on and what the broader issue is. I think this is one of the challenges in the scientific environment or research environment, academia, is that we tend to get very much in the weeds very quickly. But sometimes it's important for people to zoom out and say, I'm working on such and such, but it really is related to the broad problem of X. And being able to, first of all, describe what that broader issue is and provide the context for the research is a very valuable part. And it's not, I don't say it's like You said selling, and I know that we have a very difficult relationship with that word, Crystal. Like, oh, it sounds so forced. It sounds so like calculating. It sounds so, sort of self-serving. And that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is making people aware of the good work you're doing. And also, let me give you an example. So on your LinkedIn page, if you are a grad student in your 4th year working on some high energy physics thing, in the description of what you're doing in your research, give some broader context. We are working on a way to do such and such. And often try to be quantitative. We're trying to improve the resolution of this measurement by 10 times, which will provide a big breakthrough in our understanding of X. That kind of way of giving people an impression of the magnitude of what you're working on and its significance, I think, are 2 very critical ways in which early career scientists can give people better perspective. Another thing that commonly happens, you're in an airplane or you're having dinner and somebody's spouse is sitting there and they work at, some company, et cetera. And they're like, oh, what do you do? And, it's oftentimes that grad students can be like a little sheepish. Well, getting my PhD. It's like, no, show them the interest of like, yeah, I'm getting my PhD in such and such. And I'm also interested in these other things. Tell me what you do. And so I think that sometimes part of telling people, part of creating good opportunity to tell people what interests you is also asking people what interests them. And so these are ways I think that we need to get as early career scientists better habituated to being proactive in our communication. And I would also say a final example, like you're on a plane, you pop up your laptop and you could either do 2 hours of like, emails, you could like replot the data, you could like get that graph done for your advisor, blah, blah, blah. But there's this person sitting next to you and you have no idea what their story is. And you're curious and you glance over at their laptop and like they're working on, they work for a company called Palantir. You've heard something about that. So you have a choice. You can either keep, nose to the grindstone, or you can choose to engage this person in conversation. My advice to you is simply engage. You never know what you learn by having a 30-minute conversation. And if you really do need to do that graph, after 30 minutes, say, I'd love to keep talking. I do need to get this thing done for my boss. He can be very stickler. And you can very politely disengage from the conversation and get back to work. But that's my number one advice, is like that 80-10-10 rule is not about like telling everybody how great you are, which can feel a little artificial. It's simply engaging people in conversation, sharing with them what interests you, and asking good questions. How's that, Crystal?
Yeah, I think that's very good. So it's not always necessarily a thing you can like sit down, like I've blocked off this time to do that 10 minutes. It's happening kind of throughout your, what you're going about in your daily life. That makes a lot of sense.
That's right. And we'll talk now. In fact, we're at the end of our 5-minute break, so people can become coming back to their laptop, and welcome everybody to settle in for our last portion. And this is one of the things we'll talk about, is one of the critical specific methods of this networking process called informational interviewing. So you want to get started on that, Crystal?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, let's move on then. Everybody, welcome back to the second portion. We've front loaded it, so we have about 30 or 40 minutes left here. So I want to talk about this issue of focusing, because up until now, we've given these broad discussions of self-assessment, of exploration, and these patterns of habit that can help you broaden your perspective and give you a broader sense for opportunities that may come your way. But what I want to focus on in this latter portion of the workshop is the specific tactics of developing career opportunities and job opportunities. The third part of that pyramid that I showed you early on in my presentation, this idea of focusing, is about this idea of developing specific scenarios and developing methods by which you can connect to key opportunities, to become, in some senses, an insider, so that you know that certain opportunities might be coming your way. In some respects, look, You're good researchers, right? You're very good at researching subjects. I recommend that you become a researcher of your career and these different career fields, and do it as thoroughly as you do your research. In some ways, it's like stalking. You need to become a stalker. You need to stalk your opportunities. I know that sounds kind of creepy, but do it in a good way. There are lots of different ways of doing this. Informal informational interviewing, interning, volunteering, part-timing, moonlighting, consulting, and even incorporating the outside world into your research. But the one I want to really zero in on is this informational interviewing. I know that many of you have not even heard of this term, informational interview. And an informational interview is a very well-established process across the United States for getting key information about job opportunities and about career fields. You literally, I'll show you how to do it, but it's basically an opportunity for you to go out and meet with somebody in a career that interests you. You are in control. You can ask sticky questions. You can see people in the actual work environment. You can get and elicit feedback and advice. You can see that the environment sounds good to you. You can gain visibility, and you can practice your interviewing skills. These are all the reasons why informational interviewing has become one of the most popular ways that people end up using it as part of their career search. So let's talk about this method of informational interviewing. I will give you a methodology, specific steps to take you from the beginning to the end of the informational interview. Step one, identify people you want to speak to. So you go back into your self-assessment. You ask what companies, organizations, or jobs interest you. Where are people using similar tools or techniques to what you're using? Where geographically are you interested in working? Or what trends or fields are you interested in learning about? What questions do you want to answer? The goal of this first step is to arrive at a short list of organizations or people for you to focus on, to get an interview from. Okay, step one complete. Step two, reaching out and contacting these people. Now that you have a set of targets, who do you know at these target organizations? Maybe you know some people, maybe you don't know anybody. Well, then who do you know who knows somebody at your target organizations? This is where your network comes in, because you're going to ask a favor from your friend to introduce you to this other person who's at that organization. Where are they in the organization? Where do they sit? What is their job title? You can learn a lot simply by reading somebody's LinkedIn page and then by going on the company and learning more about the company's organization. Are there any other things that possibly connect you to these people? For example, many of you fail to realize that your undergraduate and your graduate institutions have a huge alumni database. And these are volunteers who graduated from the same university that you're in now, who've been willing, they've signed up to talk to people who are interested in their career. And so this database is available to you, and you can get introduced to these people, and that might be a connection that you can exploit. Then you need to get their email address. So the goal in step two is to have a specific plan, usually how to address these people by email and request an informational interview. Either you're going to reach out to them cold, or if you have a friend in common, you're going to get your friend to reach out to them and ask on your behalf. Step three, make the request. As I said, you reach out to the individual directly, or have your friend in common make a warm introduction by email, and then explain clearly what who you are and why you'd like to talk to them, and what you'd like to learn. Promise them no more than 30 minutes, but be flexible and make sure that you can expand the agenda if the opportunity arises. And then make it very easy. Offer to come to their office when convenient. You can also meet for coffee if that's more convenient, etc. And again, this is where some persistence is valuable. Be pleasant but persistent. Busy people are busy, so do try to make sure that you're diligent and timely and react to when they respond to you. Professional, friendly persistence is a good thing. It's good to demonstrate those habits, particularly as a PhD. The goal of step three, the time and the place for your interview. Step four, prepare them and yourself. Continue to research the person, send them a short bio about yourself. The value of a bio is it doesn't feel like you're looking for a job. It's more a way to help prepare somebody for a productive conversation. Also ask if it would be possible, helpful, convenient to meet others while you're there, maybe even offer to give a technical talk if you're going to a workplace where that would be appropriate. And also consider how you will address the logistics for the interview. Think more about what you want to learn and prepare your questions. The goal is to maximize the value of their and your time during this interview process. Step number 5, have a great interview. Give a great first impression. You're like, what do you mean by that, Peter? Well, what I mean is give a good handshake. You're not clear if you have a good handshake, go try your handshake out on your friends. They'll let you know if it's firm. Make eye contact. Here's a little trick. When you first meet somebody, you reach out your hand, you shake them, and you look them in the eyes long enough to discern the color of their eyes. In North America, that's the perfect amount of eye contact. So shake their hand and make a note of the color of their eyes. Roll through your questions, but follow your instincts. Be mindful of time and check in with your close to the scheduled end. Many informational interviews can run long, especially if you find additional connections. Then thank them and be clear on any possible follow-up. Get their email address. And the goal of this step is to leave them with the impression that you are smart, outgoing, and curious, and interested in their work. Step number 6, follow-up and anchoring. Thank them by email for their time. Complete the follow-up items you discussed. Make an appointment on your phone for 3 months' time. This is a trick I talked about earlier. Then 3 months later, email them an update. Tell them what's gone on since you had your informational interview and thank them again. The goal is to stick in their minds as a positive, thorough, proactive, and polished technical professional. If you do this the right way, that person who was previously a stranger or just a friend of a friend will become a member of your network, and you can ask them for additional advice and support as you pursue your job search. Okay, 6 steps to successful informational interview. So final advice for you, in some respects, it is like a formal interview for a job. Even though they're not advertising a job and you're not, strictly speaking, looking for a job, you should be prepared. Do your homework, think carefully about what you want to learn, prepare questions, act professionally, and thank them graciously. In some ways, it is not a formal interview for a job, and you should not act like it's sort of a trial or a sniffing around for a job. You shouldn't ask for a job. You should say, I'm looking for information. And you should also realize that you may speak with one person, they might be very helpful, but you may not have the whole story after speaking with one person. Often people ask me, why do people do this informational interview thing? Like, what's in it for them? The answer is there's lots of reasons. One, many people got their job opportunities through informational interviewing, and people like to give back. People also like talking about themselves. Hey, it beats working for half an hour. And then finally, finding fresh talent is critical to an organization's success. Even though they're not trying to fill a job right now, it is often the case that when people are proactive and ask for an informational interview, a company might be asking, well, what does this person have? What do they know? Could they be a potential hiring prospect in the future? Finally, information transfer is a two-way process. They may learn something very interesting from you. There could be something you could share about your research or what's going on in your department that might be a very big value to them. There are lots of other ways to become an insider. Even as a grad student, you could potentially do an internship, you could potentially volunteer. Depending on the status of your visa and what you're doing in grad school, you could potentially work part-time outside of your department. The term moonlighting refers to working outside when you don't have permission. There's also the possibility that you could be involved in some consulting. The reason I bring consulting up is that consulting is a specific flavor of outside work that academia recognizes. In fact, there are very established policies in academia for doing consulting, either as a professor, but grad students can do it too. Finally, incorporating outside topics into your research. You never know where you might be able to hook in some very interesting additional subject matter into your research due to the networking that you do. I had a friend of mine in grad school. She was very interested in policy, but she was a geochemist. She ended up deciding to do a chapter for thesis on the public policy implications of mercury poisoning and mercury contamination in the state of California. And that was an extra project she did as part of her PhD thesis, which was largely a spectroscopy and looking at absorption of metals onto clay surfaces. The result was she ended up with a PhD thesis that had this extra dimension, this policy dimension, and that distinction set her off in a very successful career. So you never know where you can potentially incorporate outside topics into your research and enhance and expand your research portfolio as a result. Now, I know that many of you had signed up for this workshop and you were like, well, are we ever going to talk about like actually getting a job? Sure. But as I said, the job search process is really the final step in a much larger bunch of preparation. So also I found over the years that many grad students and postdocs actually have a lot of good information already about resumes and CVs. So I'm going to jump to the final exam for resumes and CVs. And I'm going to start with, true or false. True or false, everybody, the purpose of a resume is to get you a job. True or false, the resume is a description of all your past achievements and work history. True or false, an individual resume can be sent out to many different employers without alteration. True or false, CVs and resumes are basically interchangeable. All right, you ready for the answers? The purpose of a resume is not to get you a job, it's to get you an interview. I know that sounds like semantics, but the reason I bring this up is a lot of people tend to obsess about the resume. They focus a whole weekend worrying about fonts and borders and lines and bullets and stuff like that. Look, get your resume polished, make sure it's proofread so it has no mistakes, and move on. Your resume needs to be adaptable. It's not this fixed in stone thing like a publication. It should be a description of those past experiences that are most relevant to the position being sought. One hiring manager told me a resume is as much about where you are going as where you have been. I thought that was a very interesting take. So you should adapt your resume to each specific job opening. And you should look at that job, look at your notes from your informational interview, and use the words that you heard, either in the job description or in the informational interview, as much as possible. That will make sure that the employer sees the connection between your background and what they need. CVs and resumes are totally interchangeable documents. They should not be used interchangeably. CVs are appropriate for academia. They are typically a huge, long data dump of absolutely everything about you. Resumes, in contrast, are typically one page. They can sometimes be 2 pages, but they are a distillation of that past experience that's most relevant to the position. If you are uncertain as to which they want, ask them. Don't guess. I got some great advice years and years ago when I was first drafting my first resume, and that is it's very easy for you to talk about what you're responsible for. Instead, talk about the things you did. Use what they called action-rich past tense verbs. These are words that convey very specific information, have very specific value, and give a very clear and impressive understanding of what you were doing in your work. So just look at this list and think about how you have been doing some of these things. And these words should be part of your description in each of your past elements in your resume. The best resumes connect clearly with the job being advertised. They highlight key accomplishments that are relevant, are cleanly laid out and easy to follow. The best cover letters are engaging, direct, and well-written, and they also challenge the reader to rethink their perceived notions of you. In particular, for those of you who have an advanced degree in physics or science who are applying for a job for which that degree is not required necessarily, one of the things you may want to address right out in the cover letter is say, I know you see that I have a PhD in physics and you think I'm applying to the wrong job. Let me tell you why this opportunity is so interesting to me, and then tell your story. That can be a very compelling way to address something that might seem to be a mismatch between your background and the opportunity you're seeking. There's lots of great advice. Some of the best advice is archived, and so I have a bunch of old columns on nextwave.org where you can dredge up some of these past columns. There's lots of great resume advice. If you are at a university right now, your Career Planning and Placement Center has people who can give you excellent resume advice. Sometimes it's just helpful to look at other people's resumes so you can get a sense for how somebody else has solved the problem. Congratulations, you have an interview. This is super exciting. Interviews are super exciting and super stressful. And one piece of advice I have for you is be prepared to tell good stories. Tell stories about your past and what you did. A really great way to structure an answer to a question in a story format is to think of the acronym STAR, S-T-A-R. In this acronym, you construct your answer by first describing the situation or task that you encountered, the background, what the challenge was, the action, what you did to address the situation or solve the problem, and R, the result of your actions. And there are plenty of examples in my book where you can listen, and a typical STAR answer won't last more than a minute or two. It can be 200 words, but it can be a very succinct way for you to answer specific questions. And some of these questions you can anticipate in an informational interview or even a job interview. And so you can prepare in advance some of these questions. Congratulations, you have a job offer. I know you think it would never come, but believe me, throughout your career, you are going to have nice moments where you have that point at which somebody has called you with good news. Now, I know it's tempting for you to think your job is done, but even at this stage, it's very important for you to be able to negotiate effectively. So here's my advice to you. First of all, delay the salary negotiations as long as possible. Try not to get locked into a salary before you're offered a job. If you have a website where they're asking for salary history, try to give a range. Try to leave it blank if you can leave it blank. But honestly, salary range should be irrelevant. Salary history should be irrelevant to the job. Also, go to websites like salary.com or Glassdoor and understand what the potential job salary range might be given the geography and the location and the job title. Secondly, a lot of people focus on salary, but we're talking about a job offer which is a compensation package, which is a whole group of other things that might be up for negotiation. So there's lots of other things that could be part of a compensation package that you may not appreciate. This is just a list that I came up with in 5 minutes. But one of the common things that good negotiators do is they don't look at the negotiation process as a battle. They look at it as an opportunity to solve a problem, okay? Because you and the employer actually both share a problem. The problem is, how can you maximize the value of your engagement? And the way you do that is by asking questions. In a way, it's like, think of it like a matrix. You have the set of terms in a potential job offer, right? Some of these terms are very important to you, that you have like very specific goals, and some of the terms are very flexible. For example, maybe your spouse has healthcare coverage, right? So you don't even really need to worry about healthcare coverage because you're already covered by your spouse, right? So that's one thing you could be flexible on. The employer has the same set of terms. Some of the things they have lots of inflexibility on, and some things they are flexible on. So between the two of you, you map out where there's flexibility and where there isn't, and you arrive at a set of terms for each of those variables that ends up maximizing the value of the opportunity. That's how a good negotiator works. It's very much like being a scientist. Can you get the offer raised? The more these factors are true, the greater your flexibility. You possess unique abilities. They have few other candidates for the job. The search has been going on a long time. It's a unique position in the organization. You have other offers, and they really need someone soon. The more of those things that are true, the greater your flexibility, the greater your bargaining power, right? In contrast, you will have less flexibility if the following is true. The job is at an entry level and similar to others in the organization. The organization is highly structured and rigid, and the organization expects you will take what is offered. In other words, if it's a postdoc, you don't necessarily have a lot of flexibility. So my friends, here's a small piece of advice. Go back in time to when you had your job interview, right? And I know you think that the number one goal you had in your job interview was to simply make a good impression, give a good interview, right? And that was certainly a very important goal, but there was another goal that you should have had back when you were doing your interview. That goal is you should try to discern the answers to some of these questions in the top. Now, sometimes you won't know how the job search is going for the company, but sometimes you can ask questions, casual questions, which can be very revealing. Over lunch, you can simply ask, so you probably had a lot of people apply for this job, right? You take a bite of lunch. And the person says, well, no, actually, we tried to fill the job last fall and we didn't get enough candidates, so we reopened it this spring. Well, that's very interesting now, don't you think? So sometimes you can elicit information about how the job search has gone from their standpoint. Now, the other way you can tell is if they call you and they want you to make a decision quickly because they have somebody else that they might also consider if you drop them. So these are ways in which you can kind of figure out where they are in the process. Another thing to do, really a very important thing to do, is to make sure during your job interview that you understand the next steps, right? Ask them during the job interview, when do you expect to make a decision? Oh, if I don't hear from you in a certain period of time, would it be okay if I check in with you? That way you can give yourself license to check in with them. These can be very sanity-saving measures. Some final advice about interviewing: arrive early. 15 minutes is ideal. 45 minutes is a little neurotic. So 15 minutes, perfect. Sit, chill out. Better yet, if you're really nervous, go the day before. Literally drive to the place. Swing by the day before, look at the parking lot, etc. It gives you some sense. Bring along extra copies of your resume. Give a good handshake. I told you before, if you're unclear about how good your handshake is, try it out on your friends. You know my trick about eye contact, a very simple technique to make sure you have made good eye contact. Make a mental note of the color of your interviewer's eyes. Ask questions. It's better be clear about questions than go down some tangent. And finally, some very important pieces of advice. Be yourself. Don't think you have to put on some, some affected persona to be successful. Be yourself. Be curious. Be uncertain when it's appropriate, but also I find that positivity and curiosity really shine in attractive candidates. Okay, to wrap this up, I will tell you that there are some very important concerns that people outside of academia have about us. Okay, and these concerns you need to address. According to many business people, academics and scientists are simple-minded about money, impractical about time, have no sense of deadlines, and are socially passive and value ideals as absolutes. That you're inflexible, impractical, and not team-oriented. Other potential perceptions that you may need to overcome: that you're a hermit and not a leader, that you're arrogant and not a team player, that you're a rebel and not an organizer, that you're a problem person and not a solution person. So my friends, in all your dialogue and your informational interviews, as you go out there and present yourself to the world, tell people stories in which you are not these things. Okay, tell people stories about how in grad school you've had to manage complex projects on time and on budget, how you've had to work in teams. These are things they don't know about you. And these are great stories you can tell, but you've got to be proactive and address some of these stereotypes. And also admit it, you have your own misconceptions, you have your own stereotypes. You think that, oh, well, academia, research is the only place where smart people are, and everybody in business is a bunch of, money grubbing, simpletons. No, no, no. I will tell you that there are some delicious, challenging, intellectually stimulating, quantified problems out there in business, in the nonprofit world. There are lots of exciting and important places for smart people to have an impact. Don't think that just because you've remained in academia, that academia is the only potentially interesting place. To sum it up, everything you've done so far, your thesis, your research, all this sort of stuff, has given you a very valuable thing, a very deep and very specific set of knowledge and expertise. It's very skinny, but it's very deep. I like to describe it as like the keel of a boat, right? And keels are very valuable because keels keep the boat upright, right? But if all you have is this narrow focus, you will fit into a very narrow range of opportunities. I recommend that you take all this great stuff you've done so far, which your school has given the opportunity to develop, and you add on the adaptability, problem-solving skills, drive, and leadership that are innate within you, but you may not have fully expressed, okay? If you show the world that you're simultaneously a subject matter expert and a broadly adaptable problem solver, you will be a T-shaped person, a very attractive person for today's economy. But you know what, this stuff up here? No university, no PhD advisor can teach you that stuff. That's what you have to do on your own. That's what you have to spend time doing. developing those broader things so that you can show up in the world like this. There are some myths and there's some realities in today's job market. Myth number one, find a job that matches your skills. Well, I'll tell you that skills, values, and interests are all critical aspects of finding a fulfilling career. Thomas Friedman wrote in The Lexus and the Olive Tree, you always end up overvaluing what you know and undervaluing what's out there in plain sight. Myth number two, employers care only about technical skills for PhDs. No, no, no. Employers care about a lot of things in addition to your technical skills. They care about your personality, degree of fit, learning ability, leadership, communication skills, persuasion skills, and drive. One person I interviewed who's a VP for product development at a major chemical manufacturer said, we hire for attitude and train for skills. I said, even for PhDs? She said, especially for PhDs. She said, the number one determiner of PhD success in our business is not what university they came from or their number of publications, it's their attitude. If they show an ability to adapt, if they're eager and curious and want to contribute to improving our business, those people are successful. The people who want to work on their own, decide what problems are interesting to them, are often the people who we have to let go. Myth number three, you can map out your career trajectory many years in the future. Well, the narwhal knows that serendipity, unplanned detours, and even setbacks are inevitable in your career. The people who can exploit chance opportunities, explore new areas, and make the best of setbacks tend to be happier and more successful. And that two-column list I showed you earlier, the astrophysicist turned financial analyst, said to me 5 years ago, I would have never predicted that I would have ended up here. You just don't know what opportunities are out there for you until you explore. Some final thoughts for you. Job hunting in this new century involves personal connections, chance encounters, and random opportunities. It's very much a stochastic process. So think of it like a physicist. The more people you know, it's sort of like your job cross-section. The more people you know, the bigger your network, the more that you will intersect these opportunities, and something interesting will come your way. And this is true in science. Getting a job in science requires all the same job hunting skills and techniques as any job, including getting a job in academia. All the same strategies apply. I will also tell you that thinking about finding a job is stressful, demoralizing, and produces anxiety. Actually doing something about finding a job is liberating, empowering, and yes, fun. And frankly, the real reason I give these workshops and why Crystal and I collaborate on this message is that we found that as a physicist, you can serve science, your community, and your country in all sorts of different environments. Don't be afraid to consider a non-traditional career path just because it's unfamiliar to you, your advisor, your department, or your family. There are a lot of very complex, delicious problems out there, begging for smart people like you. So go out there, find those problems, meet those people, and I guarantee you that you'll be amazed at some of the opportunities you find. I'll simply tell you, like, if we could magically, like, maybe we should, Crystal, email all of today's participants in 5 years, right? And each of you write back to us. I guarantee you, you will not believe the places you're going to go in the next 5 years. So get out there, do great work. You know that I have my Nature columns. You can find a lot of those on Nature. And now in our last 15 minutes, we want to do two things. Crystal has set up a feedback site so you can give us advice on this workshop. We always find it valuable for you to give us advice. So here is the link. We would be grateful if you would fill out this Google Sheet and give us feedback about what you liked about this workshop. And especially because we had to do this as a webinar. Normally, I would be standing in front of you in Denver, Colorado, but we're not doing that this year. We're being safe. So give us some great advice, and we would love to benefit from your advice as to how to make this workshop better. And I'm going to leave this up so you can copy the link. But what we're going to do is now shift into final Q&A mode. And Crystal has been gathering all your questions, and she will now give us some of the questions from you, the audience. So Crystal, yeah, what have you got for us?
Great, yeah, Peter, thank you. Yeah, again, thanks for showing everybody the link. It would really mean a lot to us if you could just take a minute to give us some feedback on the presentation. Hopefully you found it very useful. I love Peter's work. So I also want to mention one other quick thing. I have been getting a few questions about materials associated with this. So as we said at the beginning, this is being recorded and a recording will be emailed to you. You know, if you registered, you're going to get a follow-up email from the system with a link to the recording. You should all also have a handout section on your control panel. It says handouts.
It's right here. I can see it, Crystal. Yeah, there it is. Booklet APS. Right there.
So if you click on that, that is a PDF booklet as a companion to Peter's wonderful presentation. So it's a lot more in depth. There's a lot more exercises and sort of things for you to go through. So just to be clear, it includes a lot of what he talked about, but it's also a lot of extra activities and information. So please take a moment to download that booklet. It's a really important resource that goes along with the presentation. Okay, and yeah, of course you can continue asking questions. We've got some great ones here, but we're still, you know, please enter questions into the questions box. Okay, so a couple of, this was a very good question. I really thought this was interesting. So, and there's a couple about your background and your choices.
Yeah.
So you got your MBA, and
Yes.
so part of the reason was what they wanted to know was why or what value you feel like you got specifically from an MBA degree. And a related question, if you don't have an MBA, but you have developed a lot of leadership skills and business management skills and things like that, is it a hindrance to employers? I mean, can you make the case for having those skills without an actual MBA? I think that's the spirit of the question.
Great, wonderful question, and thank you for picking that one out, Crystal. So yes, it is true. I got an MBA, and you know, honestly, sometimes I feel a little sheepish about it because I talk up the PhD so much, and people can be like, you know, what the heck? You know, you just talked to me how valuable my PhD is, but you had to get an MBA, so what gives? Okay, so here's the deal. For starters, MBAs come in a lot of flavor and a lot of quote unquote cost, and I say that cost in air quotes because I chose to do an evening MBA program at UC Berkeley while I was still a scientist at Lawrence Livermore Lab. One of the big advantages of that is I kept my day job, and even more importantly, I was able to kind of contextualize a lot of what I was learning in my MBA in my life as a scientist. And so I guess that's one big piece of advice is sometimes there can be a big opportunity cost associated with going back to grad school again. And like 2 years in an MBA, you can end up with a huge tuition bill and like loans, et cetera, et cetera. You don't want to do that. You want to figure out, because you're a smart, clever scientist, how I can get that MBA if I want it, but have somebody else pay for it. In my case, Lawrence Livermore Lab had a tuition discount structure. So I was actually able to get a lower price on my MBA. Other companies will commonly invest in their employees by giving them training, including potentially allowing them to do an MBA and even paying for it if they stay with the company for a few years. So if an MBA is something that, you know, interests you, one strategy would be to simply say, where can I go where an employer might actually invest in me by giving me the opportunity to do an MBA. The other thing is that the MBA is a full degree program. It's got a lot of like bells and whistles, including some stuff that, you know, in hindsight, probably 80% of the value I got from my MBA came from 20% of the stuff that I took. Similarly, I think that you can find ways of assembling some critical information on either smaller short courses or other environments. And so those are places where I would also seek. And then the final thing is what I got from my MBA was, my motivation to do the MBA was I was a material scientist working on like planetary materials, right? So it's not exactly a technical subject that like lent itself to like the startup world. It's not like we're going to be like making bricks on Mars anytime soon. So I didn't particularly have in my technical background anything that was like immediately commercializable. So I felt like also a better approach for me would be to focus on technology from the business side. How do we commercialize technologies? What are the strategies for doing that? A very interesting program you might consider, everybody, is that the National Science Foundation and the Department of Energy run this thing called the I-Corps program, ICORPS. It stands for Innovation Corps. It's an 8-week program open to people who are receiving funding from those two agencies who have interest in commercializing the technology they're working on. But what's interesting about that program, it's only 8 weeks long. It's very intense, but I have now become a teacher in the DOE I-Corps program, and it has provided our scientists with almost like a mini MBA experience. Very intense, but very practical insights that they've gained. Some of them have gone on to start companies, but many of them have gone back to research, but with a new perspective from the business experience they got. So there are lots of different ways to assemble an MBA experience without necessarily biting the huge, 6-figure bullet of going out and paying for it. How's that, Crystal?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's very useful information for people. Yeah, no, I think that's great. Okay, a couple of more questions are trickling in here. So a couple of a little bit, one is about kind of your experience and another is related to kind of things that are happening in industry. So early on, somebody asked, so you did a bunch of informational interviews with people in industry, and then you continued to have kind of an academic-ish or national lab kind of research track. Can you talk about why at that point you decided to take that direction instead of, say, going directly into the private sector?
Sure. Well, so yeah, so here I am an example of like a quote unquote non-traditional pathway, but as I said, there's no such thing as a traditional pathway. So I was, a early career scientist. I did a postdoc at Lawrence Livermore Lab. I jumped out to try a year in science policy, felt for various reasons that wasn't the right thing, and I jumped back into the science world. But then in 2000 left for 18 years to do a series of startups. And at the end of my second startup was a company called Pax Water, and it was a successful startup in that we ended up growing the business quite nicely, ended up selling it. And so at the point at which we sold the company, one of the things that commonly happens is the management team is, how do I put it delicately, Crystal, invited to pursue new opportunities. So we were given our equity, but we were also given our walking papers, and I kind of had a choice at that point. I could have either pursued another startup or kind of jumped into another business world. But as a scientist, one of the things that I felt, having spent 10 years in the water industry, was that there was really not enough research, basic research that was supporting this industry. And so I was very excited when Lawrence Berkeley National Lab reached out to me, hearing that I was literally, kind of in between assignments. They were eager to build a research program on water treatment research. And they were looking for somebody who had a combination of research experience, industry experience, policy experience, and startup experience. And this funny career that I'd had, Crystal, with all this kind of weird, seemingly dead ends, like going this direction and back again, it turned out that all that stuff ended up being absolutely super critically valuable for the job I'm in now. And so I decided, so they recruited me back into the national lab world, which is where I am now. And then so for everybody, I was hired with basically one big assignment, which was to win this huge 5-year, $100 million water hub opportunity for Lawrence Berkeley Lab. And it was a 2-year proposal process. It was like a ton of work, but we competed and we won. Yay! So now I'm the executive director of this program. And honestly, I credit the people at Lawrence Berkeley Lab to have faith in somebody like me to come back into the research world after 18 years. And I give them credit for seeing how they could make me successful and how my unusual background and experience would be valuable to the lab. And so this is maybe I'm a living example of what I've been talking about. Is I know we think about these careers as being like very linear things, but you never know when the sort of unusual experience on your part years later could come back to pay enormous dividends. And so here I am helping the United States develop the 21st century portfolio of water treatment technologies. And I'm using all the skills as a scientist and even all the skills that I developed in business. And it's a very enjoyable place for me. And even now, I know that it's not the last career I have. So this is what careers are like in the 21st century.
Yep.
But I appreciate the opportunity to share that with everybody, Crystal. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, exactly. I feel like it must be your, this unicorn, speaking of unicorns, like this perfect job that just randomly kind of hits all these different areas of expertise. And that's the thing, we just don't know what kind
That's
of
right.
opportunities are going to happen. So the key thing is you need to recognize the opportunity and act, as you've said
And
already.
I'd say,
Yeah.
and I'd say also just like kind of keep your heart open, right?
Yeah.
Just keep your heart open to the idea that as a smart, clever, interested young person, that there's a huge galaxy of potential things for you. And don't ever surrender to the idea that, oh, my options are limited, blah, blah, blah. That narrative is just totally unhelpful, right? It's A, it's not true, and B, it's just there's no value in entertaining that narrative.
Right, absolutely. Okay, so again, I'm getting lots of questions. It's hard to decide in our limited time kind of what I should focus on. I think this is maybe will pertain to a larger section of people, so I'm going to switch gears. Someone was asking, okay, so like you go to the interview, what do you do if it doesn't go well? Is there a way to salvage what's happening? Any advice there?
I don't know. I mean, it's funny, like you think it's not going well. I don't know. People are awkward. You spill mustard on your shirt. You bungle something. I guess the thing is you can win a lot of territory back with self-awareness. Not self-deprecation, but I would simply say to acknowledge, like, I'm so sorry, like, I think I've just completely screwed up that answer. Can I answer again? Would you mind if I like say this again? Or, hey, I really feel like I didn't give you a good perspective. Let me try again.
Yeah.
To demonstrate your, I would say, courage to acknowledge your own like imperfection, and then to volunteer to get back again when things happen. So, no, you're fine. Well, let's say that would be great. In which case, you also get an opportunity to set the record straight. So I'd say that be candid and be, open-hearted in that process. You will make a very positive impression. Sometimes people who screw up and like recover can seem like even more compelling candidates.
Yeah, I think that's a really good piece of advice. I think just if I may add to it, it's funny. I agree. Acknowledging it and then trying again is really important. But I think it's important to do that step of trying again. It can be really awkward when somebody's like, "Oh, this interview." I've been in a situation where someone actually said, "Oh, this interview isn't going well," and just kind of left that hanging, and it was like, "Oh boy, this is uncomfortable."
And it's like, you don't want to be a solutions person. This is instead of a problem person. It's not to say, oh, I don't think this interview is going well. Say, I'm concerned this interview isn't going well. Let me try something different.
Yeah.
And then be like, that's a solution person.
Yeah.
And that's a very different quality.
Yeah, I completely agree. Okay, I'm really regretful to say this because we do have a few more really good questions, but folks, we're just kind of out of time right now for the official kind of webinar. I apologize if we didn't get to your questions. You can follow up, sending an email to webinars@aps.org, and we'll try to get those questions answered. I might be able to answer a couple of those questions that have come in myself. As we've already said,
please give us feedback on this webinar, especially since this was originally going to be a live thing. I'd love to know how you felt it went in terms of pace, engagement. Any other advice you have would be great.
Yeah, there's an opportunity to leave longer bits of feedback. Please copy that link or click the one that's in the chat real quick and put it in a window so you can respond to that after we signed off. Both a recording of a video of the recording will be sent out to you. Also, don't forget to click on that booklet under handouts if you haven't yet. The email that contains the link to the recording will come out in about 48 hours. And that's all I have today. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. And we hope that we will see you again at another APS webinar sometime soon. And thanks again, Peter.
Thank you, Crystal. Great talking to you.
All
Bye,
right.
everybody.
Bye-bye. American Physical Society, copyright 2020, all rights reserved. Bye-bye.